season. If you're following us on Twitter at StripesMMPod, you're probably getting an idea of some of the folks we've got coming on to talk about the different topics in the world of defense. If you're not, then go and subscribe now so you don't miss the new episodes. It's Twitter at StripesMMPod. So while we're working on next season, we'll be re-releasing an episode from our archive. And in case you missed it, or ICYMI as the cool kids say on the digital webs and the inner tubes, this is a chance to maybe catch an episode that went under your radar, or to re-listen with a different perspective. This week, we're re-releasing our interview with Michael Ames, co-author of American Cipher, Bowe Bergdahl, and the U.S. Tragedy in Afghanistan. Like many of you, when the story of Bergdahl came out, I was infuriated and blamed Bergdahl completely. But we also didn't have the full story. If you think you know the story of Bowe Bergdahl, I would encourage you to read American Cipher and then make up your mind. Were there red flags about Bergdahl that should have kept him from joining the military in the first place? Did military commanders push their own agendas in the name of searching for Bergdahl and getting people hurt in that process? Was he really a traitor or prisoner of war? Jack Murphy talks with Michael Ames about an American Cipher.
Michael, it's been a little while since we've spoken. You're the author of American Cipher, a whole book about Bowe Bergdahl and the trials and tribulations that he went through. Why here in 2022, Bergdahl, he was a POW from 2009 to 2014. I mean, why is this story still relevant right now in 2022?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for having me on to do this today. Look, it's been almost a decade since he came home. It's been 13 years since this all went down in Afghanistan from service members who were there. And the truth of what happened is still essentially unknown, buried by the Pentagon and the political infotainment media, as I like to call it. Myths have been accepted as facts, and facts have been a casualty of the war and of this particular scandal. The reality that really needs to be known and that should rise over time is that the top commanders in the U.S. military in the summer of 2009, Stan McChrystal, Mike Flynn, David Petraeus, knew that Bowe Bergdahl had been smuggled over the border into Pakistan within 3 to 4 days of his disappearance. And then they sent thousands of Americans on so-called searches to go find a guy who they knew was already gone. And that reality remains buried, and it is true. It has been sourced through dozens of sources in the military and the intelligence community. It is a fact, and it is a fact that is needs to be more widely known and deserves to be accepted as fact as time goes on and we get some distance and perspective on the longest foreign war in American history.
Yeah, I've definitely spoken to people who have told me the same, that basically if you submitted a CONOP or concept of operations, a mission plan for people who weren't in the military that had something to do with finding Bowe Bergdahl, that it would get approved. It was an easy way to get missions approved because it had to do with rescuing an American citizen. Even though those missions had nothing, as you said, had nothing really to do with Bergdahl, who was already smuggled over the border into Pakistan. And I think it's kind of a travesty when you think about it, that soldiers have been wounded and to this day blame Bowe Bergdahl, like that was your fault that I got hurt on this operation trying to find you, when really there were commanders in Afghanistan who cynically used Bowe Bergdahl's captivity to get those operations approved.
That's right. And it's only three officers, period, refused to interview with myself or my co-author, Matt Farwell, who's an Army veteran. And those three who refused are Stan McChrystal, Mike Flynn, and David Petraeus. We didn't get refusals from anyone else. And I think that speaks volumes about what went on. Not only were there guys injured, there were men killed on quote unquote searches. They were killed in September and October. And then their families, so Bowe Bergdahl went missing on June 30th. some guys in his unit were killed in September on quote unquote searches for Bergdahl, which quite obviously were not searches. Their families, nonetheless, were trotted out on cable news to score political points, and the political entertainment system exploited those families' suffering, exploited their pain, and ended up just rolling over all of the human beings involved in this, from Bergdahl and his family to the town that he was in and where I used to live, to the soldiers who died, using these people's suffering to score political points and to further this lie that was cooked up in the summer of 2009. The whole thing is a scandal. The whole thing is a travesty, as you call it. And it's about time that the military own up to what went on out there.
Yeah. And I hope that, something that goes along with this, I hope that veterans out there become a little bit more media savvy, maybe about, I'm sad to say this as a journalist, myself, but how the media can exploit families and service members sometimes. Like I have a friend, Chris who he is one of the survivors from the attack in Benghazi. His politics are very conservative. That's who he is. But he has told me in interviews, he said this publicly, in the aftermath of that attack, I got used. They used me in the media to further a certain agenda, a certain partisan political agenda. And, people who didn't necessarily care about me or about the contractors and our ambassador who died out there that day, that people used this event to score cheap political points.
Yeah, and the media has its own needs, and they have their own chains of command, and they have their own incentives that need to be met no matter what. And I'm not saying that everyone in the media is a bad person and is immoral. I'm just saying that especially in cable news with very fast deadlines and high demand, they don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. And that's what happened, sounds like, with your friend, and that's what happened in the Bergdahl case. And, there are plenty of sources in the book, in American Cipher, and in my original reporting at Newsweek, who knew this was the case and knew this was going on. And some of them, like Gerald Sutton in the book, he knew he was being used. He figured it out pretty quickly. But he also didn't realize the complexity of the story, because the military had told them, commanders had told them this lie that they were looking for Bergdahl for months. The Army was pretty savvy in its own right. They had all of these guys sign NDAs on the ground in Afghanistan, passing out pieces of paper to guys who were waiting to shower and eat, who hadn't slept in 4 days, and they're making them sign contracts not to talk about this. Interesting. Why do you think they weren't allowed to talk about this?
Yeah, it's I've never really heard of any command handing out NDAs on a deployment like that. Yeah,
well, they handed out NDAs to hundreds of guys. I mean, I spoke to guys who said they were told if they didn't sign that NDA, they wouldn't be getting on their flight to go home. So the Army knew, the guys in intelligence and comms knew how important those NDAs were, and they knew how much it mattered to keep this story under wraps. And to a large degree, they succeeded. They only didn't succeed years later when I started doing this reporting, and I was able to connect the dots. And like I said, it's not like this all comes from one source. I have many, many, many sources. And later this was all aired out in Fort Bragg in a military courtroom. This is not my theory. It's incredible that the podcast Serial, which brought so much fame and notoriety to Bergdahl, disregarded these facts as a bunch of gossip and rumors. Well, I didn't see anyone from the podcast Serial in the Fort Bragg courtroom in 2017 when a former military intelligence officer explained exactly what had gone on here. And the fact that she was told to bury that her intelligence report putting Bergdahl in Pakistan was rejected by her commanders. She had a 16-year career in the military, and she was asked on the stand, how many times had she ever had an intelligence report rejected by her commanders? 0 until that time. It was the only time it happened in her career.
So, Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came to this story? Because I mean, you were working at like a local newspaper in Idaho, weren't you?
That's right. Yeah, I was at the time, summer of 2009. I was the editor of a little quarterly magazine called Sun Valley Magazine in Haley, Idaho, which is where Bowe Bergdahl grew up. And his father, Bob, was the UPS driver, UPS delivery man for our office and every office in town. You know, this is a small town, a few thousand people. Everyone knows the UPS driver. And every office in town had a sticker on the window, bring Bowe home. He was the cause that the town rallied around. And his father was this incredibly nice, incredibly polite, somewhat religious Protestant, Orthodox Presbyterian Christian. And we saw him grow his beard out in solidarity with his captive son. And we saw the pain in his eyes. And it was a really personal thing then to see someone who is a neighbor and a friend who you see every day going through this ordeal. It makes the world seem a little smaller, and it makes, you know, a war on the other side of the globe really come home in a real way.
Yeah, it's one of the things I noticed when I read your book. I mean, it's very enlightening, dispelled a lot of things I thought I knew about Bowe Bergdahl. But some of the most interesting stuff I thought was about his dad, Bob. And I mean, Bob really comes across as a strong Christian, someone who has strong values, and that he tried to impress that upon a young Bowe Bergdahl. But it also, I think that it sounded like it led to that a bit of a difficulty in Bowe's upbringing between him and his father. There's a bit of a split there.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you have a really strong father figure and a strong-headed son, that some of that is inevitable, right? Bowe was a stubborn, strong, physically strong, mentally strong young man who was going to do things his own way. I mean, he would ride, before he had a car, and even after he got his driver's license, he would ride his bike all over that Idaho Valley. He would ride his bike 40 miles a day without even thinking about it. So he would ride his bike to get away from home. And yeah, his father was strict. And, you know, we know all this because Bowe talked about it all in his interview with the general. And of course, Bowe's parents, Bob and Janny, participated in American Cipher. They notably, we're the only media project that his parents participated with. They did not do any interviews after that Rose Garden fiasco. They stopped doing any interviews, and they didn't trust anyone aside from our book. And I'm the only journalist they sat down with, and I recorded nearly 30 hours of interviews with them. And what they went through was a truly remarkable and awful ordeal. And his father, like I think a lot of parents were, you know, he kind of went full Liam Neeson, right? He grew out his beard and he said, I'm going to get my son back no matter what. There was nothing. And if the father and the son have something in common, it's just this 100% gung-ho devotion to their ideals, right? So they homeschooled Bowe, and they gave him this Christian-led education about his conscience being, him and his older sister, about your conscience being your most important and valuable possession that you have. You must always follow your conscience. And so when he, with his emotional issues that made him perhaps not the ideal candidate, to put it lightly, to be on the front lines in a remote outpost in Afghanistan, when he found himself out there, and all of a sudden the ideals that he had to save the oppressed people of Afghanistan from tyranny and to bring them American-style freedom, and when he saw that up close and personal wasn't actually how things were going, it kind of made his mind short circuit. And he had a crisis of conscience and a personal crisis of being able to follow orders and do what he was supposed to do, which he failed because he came up with a terribly irresponsible idea to walk off the base to attract attention to himself and be some sort of badass hero. That obviously didn't go as planned. He admitted all of this in his confession to the Army general investigating his case. But when you really know where he grew up in this distant Idaho backcountry that looked a lot like Southeast Afghanistan, and with this strong religious upbringing, it all tracks, it all makes sense. And people try to call him a traitor, and people try to call him all sorts of things. But if you actually get into his life story, it all pretty much tracks and it makes sense. It doesn't mean that he made a good decision. I'm not defending what he did, but there is a logical legibility to the story.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because, this is nothing controversial. That, war morally challenges soldiers, young men in this case. And I think it's true of, pretty much all of us see things and do things that we have to sort of reconcile and try to understand, like, what do you do with that? Where do you place that in life? How do you make sense of it? But even more so for someone like Bergdahl, from what you're describing, who did not have any sort of moral flexibility, maybe was a little bit naive to the realities of the world. And then suddenly he's part of this big machine called the U.S. Army in a very muddled, confusing war called, Operation Enduring Freedom. I can see what you're saying there.
Yeah. And that I think moral, right, in its most extreme cases, it's called moral injury. And I think that carries on for enlisted men and officers even after their service. For example, one of the best sources in this book, and one of my earliest sources for the Newsweek reporting, one of the most important sources for confirming that this was all an intelligence ruse and that the top commanders, Petraeus, Flynn, and McChrystal, knew that Bergdahl was in Pakistan. He was a lieutenant colonel, and we had to give him and he had to remain anonymous. We had to give him an alias for the book. And I asked him, why was he risking telling me all this? His retirement benefits were on the line. He was really taking a risk. And I said, why are you doing this? And he said, because he couldn't stand watching the families of those dead soldiers wheeled out on Fox News and MSNBC and CNN to cry about their sons dying for looking for a soldier. He said that didn't sit right with him. He couldn't live knowing that they were out there believing this lie. And so he had to go out and with me to tell the truth that they weren't searching for their missing soldier. In reality, they were dying on missions to stir up Taliban and win a war that the top military and civilian commanders in Washington and Kabul knew was already unwinnable by 2009. Those kids died to please the egos of insecure, powerful men who couldn't accept losing another war on their watch.
Yeah, that's the next conclusion, right? Is that if they used Bowe Bergdahl as a cynical ploy to get these operations approved, we still lost the war. But what was their thought process that they thought, what was it going to be like Vietnam? We just need to stack some more bodies and maybe we can win.
Yeah, I think they thought, okay, well, with this crisis of the missing soldier, we can lower the rules of engagement. We can send guys into every little village that we haven't been able to hit. We can exactly rack up Taliban, KIA, Vietnam style, and eventually it'll turn around. But even Mike Flynn knew that was unlikely by December of 2009. The fact that I found it really incredible, the fact that Mike Flynn was the highest ranking military person responsible for openly spreading the lie that Bergdahl was a traitor. And at one point he told a reporter in Kabul that Bergdahl was a jihadi, which fascinatingly enough was Taliban propaganda, which really raises a question about Mike Flynn's state of mind in 2009 and 2010.
Was this one of the infamous Flynn facts?
This was an infamous Flynn fact that started as Taliban propaganda, which, by the way, they still use today to talk about American hostages. There's an American hostage left in Afghanistan that I've been covering the story of for The New Yorker. That's Mark Frerichs. And it's incredible. The Taliban is still using today in 2022 the same ridiculous propaganda lies that they were using about Bowe Bergdahl in 2009 and 2010. Namely, that this American soldier had flipped sides and was now leading seminars in bomb making to Taliban rank and file. this got shopped around to gullible reporters, and it got picked up in the Daily Mail in 2010 and even the London Sunday Times, and by the head of U.S. intelligence, General Mike Flynn. General Mike Flynn went around telling people Bowe Bergdahl's a jihadi, which was Taliban propaganda, which really does, not to repeat myself, but raises a question about Mike Flynn's state of mind while he was in Afghanistan.
And General Flynn, of course, was the J2 or S2 JSOC intel officer, and then he headed up DIA at the end of his career, and today he is ostensibly a QAnon advocate, going and doing rallies around the country. To me, there are two plausible explanations for Mike Flynn. One is that he knows exactly what he's doing, and he's a brilliant, somewhat evil political genius who knows that false information can win wars and win political campaigns. And that's why he continues to spread QAnon. And it's why 12 years ago he was spreading Taliban propaganda, because he knew it was just a means to an end, and he had already become that cynical. The second possibility is that Mike Flynn had snapped at some point and lost the ability to know the difference between reality and lies. And that case is more frightening as he remains a prominent political figure. There's an amazing story that you can trace back from the Trump campaign in 2016 to this Bowe Bergdahl moment. Mike Flynn being at the head of U.S. intelligence when Bowe Bergdahl goes missing. And then 6 years later, he is Donald Trump's first pick for vice president. People don't remember this, but before Mike Pence, a red-blooded Christian evangelical conservative, Trump wanted Flynn to be his vice president. And then Flynn went on an interview with Martha Raddatz on ABC and was asked about his history as being a pro-choice Rhode Island Democrat. And that was pretty much the end of the Trump-Flynn ticket. And then he was recently interviewed by the January 6th committee, and asked if he believes in the peaceful, lawful transition of government. And he pleaded the fifth. Well,
there you go. I mean, that's that tends to make me think the latter of the two scenarios I laid out with Mike Flynn is the more likely. That this was a very smart guy who at some point snapped, lost his way, lost something about his belief in America.
You think that had something to do with the war on terror? I mean, specifically that, the conception, the image of America and American military power was just shattered in his mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think I've met enough veterans with PTSD, guys who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, that I can't help but think that perhaps Mike Flynn got touched by some of that as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was doing awfully high tempo operations in Iraq for many years, stacking up a lot of kills, right? And probably had a number of Americans die on his watch. And I for sure, as a civilian, don't know what that would do to, my sense of reality and my sense of self. But, trying to be open-minded and compassionate to the guy, I think at some point he definitely was injured. He was mentally injured, and I'm not sure he's ever recovered. He had that brief stint as National Security Advisor. That didn't go very well. And I think he's very much still a ride or die for Donald Trump and the QAnon movement. And it'll be interesting to see what he does. But it's important for people to know that as the head of military intelligence in Kabul in 2009, he was perfectly willing to ignore the fact that Bowe Bergdahl was in our allied country's borders, Pakistan, and send thousands of guys on dangerous missions to go find him in a lie. And, I don't know, maybe that kind of trade-off in your mind can start playing tricks on your ability to, it can maybe make your inner moral compass go a little haywire.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even have to speculate. I'd have a hard time doing that and having to live with that. Did you read the profile? There's a recent profile on Flynn, I believe is in the New Yorker.
I didn't see the recent one. I know my co-author, Matt Farwell, did one in the New Republic earlier this year that was entertaining. I just wanted to say too about,
Sure.
In terms of people losing their moral compass, for someone in the military where ethics and morality are celebrated and honored and are, important, to then go into civilian politics where there's no such thing as an ethical code in politics, right? Like anything goes. And then you get Donald Trump era politics with a guy from New York real estate, and New York real estate is an industry built on lies. It's an industry built on lying to people about what your real estate is worth. So for him to all of a sudden merge into that world, and that world is populated by politicians and it's populated by media, Bergdahl's hometown, Haley, where I used to live, that place was torn apart by death threats when this all went down. And those death threats were stirred up and encouraged by soulless media ghouls like people like Jesse Waters. Funny story for you about Jesse Waters that's in American Cipher, encourage people to go read this, is that he shows up in Haley, Idaho with his black leather shoes and his Manhattan suit. And he goes walking into this bike shop to find Bowe Bergdahl to interview him for Fox. And he gets in there with his camera crew. And what he finds instead is a bunch of Bob's biking buddies who were not too pleased, because by this point, the death threats had been coming in and the town had been turned upside down. And one of these guys just gets right up in Jesse Waters' face and says, get the F out of this shop or I'm going to throw you out. And it was a nice moment for the town. And it was a funny thing to put in the book because there's the reality people see on TV, and then there's the actual reality that people live in. And the guy who told Jesse Waters get out of the shop said, we're not the problem here in this town. You're the problem. You and the media who go around telling stories without even caring whether or not they're true and having people become victims of your lies. You're the problem.
And sorry to correct myself, that the article I was referencing, it's not in the New Yorker. It was in the Atlantic, published on July 8th. It's titled "What Happened to Michael Flynn" by Barton Gelman. If any of you want to read that. What reminded me of that article was some of the things you said, because one of Flynn's friends in the article is quoted saying, you spend that much time on the JSOC hunter-killer task force going after HVTs night after night. At a certain point, that'll just break you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then when you have someone who's vulnerable in that way, and like I was saying, you introduce them to people like Donald Trump and New York real estate and political operatives who have never had to follow any code of ethics to win. I think that's a pretty potent combo.
Yeah, I can see that. So to backtrack a little bit, do you want to talk about the circumstances under which Bergdahl was captured and released? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there. So, I mean, whenever we do an interview like this, I think it's a good thing to kind of rehash some of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. I think so. Misconceptions. Let's start with the capture.
Sure.
Misconceptions on the capture is that he sought out the Taliban. One of the guys in his platoon went on cable news and said that particular line. Bowe Bergdahl went looking for the Taliban about 36 times, I think, if the number was right, and really spread that lie around. It's just not true. There's no evidence for it, and it doesn't make any sense. Bergdahl was trying to walk from his outpost to an American base in this silly, stupid stunt that he concocted in his mind, but he was aware enough to know that if he ran into the Taliban, that they were going to hurt him. And that's exactly what happened. He went out there. He was wearing this headdress to try to he thought he was some sort of mixture of, Bear Grylls and Indiana Jones. and meets Lawrence of Arabia. And he was out there walking through the night and the dawn, and he got lost, and he put on this headdress, and he thought he would just look like some shepherd. Well, that wasn't going to work because the word was already out that an American was missing. And so he got rolled up by some guys on a motorcycle, probably local criminal gang, who just snatched him, no problem. I mean, he tried to run away that day. It was the first of like 3 of his different escape attempts. But they sold him up the chain as it works in that part of the world and had worked for a decade at that point. And for other high value kidnapping victims, they sold him up the chain and they smuggled him over the border to Pakistan, where he was delivered to the Haqqanis, who kept watch over him for 5 years of brutal captivity, torture. He escaped at one point for 10 days. He nearly died. I mean, anyone can say what they will about Bowe Bergdahl, but no one can deny that the kid was extremely physically and mentally tough in what he survived out there.
He was like chained to a bed at one point for like a year, wasn't he?
He was chained to a bed for a month after his first escape to wither his muscles, and they beat his feet, and they burned his feet, and they cut his torso with razors, and they tortured him for a month that way, spread eagle chained to a bed frame. And that was just the beginning. I mean, that was just the start of his 5 years as the longest held POW since Vietnam.
And so he was held like that for a long time. The political games got played back here in the United States that we discussed, and in Afghanistan. What were the circumstances that finally led up to his release?
So it took a ridiculous amount of time to work because 2009, 2010, there was no diplomacy between Washington and the Taliban. The Bush era no negotiations policy was still the policy in the early years of the Obama administration. There was no communication, to the degree that when there were couriers, right, who would deliver messages and videos between proof of life videos and things like that, ransom demands between the Haqqanis and the Americans. At one point, I forget which year it was, maybe 2011, but one of the only living and trusted couriers to bring messages between both sides, we killed him in a drone strike. There was an active, it wasn't just that we didn't negotiate, it's that we were not going to negotiate and we didn't want any negotiations. So when the Obama administration had to open negotiations with the Taliban, that in and of itself started a multi-year, incredibly complicated diplomatic project that involved diplomats from Germany, Norway, ultimately Saudi Arabia and Qatar, just to form a structure by which the Americans and the Taliban could communicate. And that continued for years until they came up with this trade. Now, it wasn't the only trade that the Taliban was willing to consider, but interestingly, it was the only trade that the Obama administration was in the end willing to consider. And that was for these 5 Taliban leaders who were always being held in a different part of Guantanamo, and were always, from all the reporting I've read, sort of saw themselves as POWs and assumed that they would one day be released. 3 of them had offered to work with the Americans to help them track down Mullah Omar or Osama bin Laden. These were guys who had already communicated with the CIA, who were already willing to wear, beacons, and they had already flipped. And they were in Guantanamo for a very long time. And the Qataris and the Germans managed the negotiations to get them out. And they signed papers, and the Qataris looked after them for a couple of years, and they signed papers promising they wouldn't go back to the war. It's a very common refrain that they went back to the battlefield. Well, I think it would be more honest to say they went back to lives of sort of air-conditioned luxury in Doha, and then ultimately in Qatar. And of course, the final irony about those 5 guys is that these were the guys that Donald Trump called bloodthirsty terrorists and said they should be killed on the campaign trail. And then a few years later, Donald Trump is sending Mike Pompeo to go beg them to negotiate in Doha for a withdrawal agreement.
And I mean, there's an entire follow up there that, I wrote about the negotiations and some of the things we were doing to put pressure on the Taliban to try to get expedite those negotiations and get us out of the country. I mean, that's a whole book in of itself that could be written there. And, if I wrote an article that touches on it, but somebody else, I'm sure, is going to write an entire book about that story and how that came about. I mean, it's wild. You
mean the peace talks in Doha?
Yeah, the peace talks in Zal, and how JSOC was putting, doing deliberate targeted strikes against Taliban leaders, and how they were timed along with the negotiations in Doha, so that while the Taliban was in there talking, their buddies were getting hit in Afghanistan, and that was so that it would force them to negotiate in good faith. There's a lot that went on there.
No, that's amazing detail, and of course, it sort of dovetails with my recent reporting about Mark Frerichs, because meanwhile, while those negotiations were going on, at the very end of those negotiations, the Taliban snatches one more high-value hostage, Mark Frerichs, who has been there now for over 2.5 years, and you have Zal Khalilzad just pretend he doesn't exist. so they're bombing Taliban allies to soften them up for negotiations. What do the Taliban do in response? They kidnap another American, so they have leverage negotiations. How does the Trump State Department, Pompeo and Khalilzad deal with that inconvenient fact? They just pretend it didn't happen. So, Bowe Bergdahl was held for 5 years for a lot of complicated reasons. This last hostage, Mark Frerichs, has been there for 2.5 years for, I think, even more maybe grotesque reasons of neglect. I mean, he's been completely neglected. And we're just, this is a bit of a tangent, but I've been covering this story for the New Yorker for the last year. And we're just waiting to see if anyone in the Biden administration has the fortitude to bring this guy home.
So the trade happens. Is there anything you want to tell us about, that day when we finally got Bergdahl into an American helicopter?
Well, whenever I think about that day, I'll never forget that day. I was the officiant for one of my best friend's weddings that day, and I was late to the pre-wedding meetup because I was standing mesmerized in front of the TV watching that Taliban video, right? Like the rest of the world. And why was I mesmerized? Because the Taliban did an amazing job that day. Let's just give credit where credit is due. They put together quite an impressive theatrical production that was then released to the international media and played on nonstop loops for days and weeks they had guys with bazookas and RPGs standing on mountaintops everywhere. And these American helicopters fly in. I mean, people remember this video. And if you haven't seen it in a while, I really encourage people to go watch it, because it is a masterclass in propaganda. And it made the Taliban look like a professional organization, and it made our side look like we were scrambling. But the story goes on from there, and there's plenty in American Cipher, I think, that's well worth people's time to read about Bowe Bergdahl's first days and weeks back in American custody. I mean, what he went through and the type of trauma that he came out of and then had to recover from is really, really remarkable and really beyond words to convey. But you can get quite a bit of that story in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think the book was really enlightening for me. One of the big takeaways, I mean, one of the things I believed for a long time, I guess, that essentially Bergdahl had committed an act of treason. I mean, the way that I saw it was that, the way he sort of broke faith, like it was, I guess I believed it too, that like basically he was going over to the other side, that he was trying to defect over to the other side. And the reporting that you did reveals a very different picture of somebody who was mentally disturbed, mentally and emotionally immature, made some incredibly poor decisions, but not somebody who was trying to commit an act of treason or defection.
No, and if anything, as you may recall from the book, when he gets back, he ends up just being a gold mine of intelligence, for U.S. For the Pentagon and the CIA and the FBI, and he had been logging all these memories. Look, the guy's got an unusual mind. Okay, he's not a typical. He's not typical on the psychological profile, and that gave him certain weaknesses that were obviously exposed, but it also gave him incredible strengths. And some of those strengths were the power of his memory and his mind. And so he was able to draw diagrams and to recall places that he was held with incredible specificity. There were all these drone strikes in the weeks and months after they got him back that it seemed very likely that had come from intelligence that he was giving in those initial debriefings. There was a split reality in 2014, and I think it's really fascinating, and we talk about it in the book, and that is that if you just got your information from the American media, you would think along the lines of what you just said. This guy was a traitor at worst. At best, he was a deserter who didn't care about America. Meanwhile, inside the military, he was being essentially protected and honored. And they literally gave him awards for his conduct in captivity. And they created just reams of intelligence from what he was able to share in those debriefings. And they thought that he and everyone I spoke to in the military, in the Pentagon, in the intelligence community who had anything to do with interviewing him left incredibly impressed by his resilience, his commitment to doing the right thing after he did the wrong thing, and in redeeming himself. And that's why, the trial was sort of a travesty in its own right. That's why the guy, to my personal belief, deserved medical benefits, which he lost. And, look, people love and people need a scapegoat. This has been true throughout history. Bowe Bergdahl was a perfect candidate for a scapegoat, and that's what he is, and that's what he remains today. But with the reporting that Matt Farwell and I compiled in our book, with American Cipher still out there, and perhaps in the future as a film project, people will learn the truth about this moment in war, and that the myths are less interesting, honestly, than the true story of Bowe Bergdahl.
And I mean, Bowe did struggle when he was released. Like, I don't know if it's true or what you heard, but I had a source tell me that when they got him out, he couldn't speak anything except for Pashto initially. There was
a moment that in the courtroom in Fort Bragg in 2017 that gives me goosebumps every time I think about it. And that is when they played over the loudspeakers in the courtroom a recording of Bowe answering some of those questions in his initial 48, 72 hours after coming home. And I've never heard a voice sound like this voice. It's hard to describe. I won't even try to impersonate it, but it sounded like, imagine if you were to if you were to go into a store and take a musical instrument, a trumpet or, a clarinet or something, and you were to just smash it and break it and then try to play it. That's what his voice sounded like. It was all over the map in terms of the octaves and the scale and the tenor. He couldn't hold a steady, and it was very high. It was much, much, much higher than his normal voice. Like, it was under an immense amount of strain, and it followed these weird speech patterns that didn't sound like English. They sounded like Pashto. And it was a very disturbing thing to hear, and it really made the trauma of what he went through very real.
That's wild, man. I mean, where is Bowe today? I mean, do you have any inkling of, how he's doing today or what he's up to?
I don't. I have no idea. And even if I did, I would probably be reluctant to share it because the guy has a target on his back for the rest of his life.
Well, yeah, I don't want to know his home address. Just curious, how his well-being is, if he's doing better in life today.
Well, we don't know. We know that during the trial in Texas, he was working. He was working for the Army. He was doing his desk job, and he was earning the respect of his colleagues there. And we know that he was working, I think, at a refuge for stray cats, for cat rescues. He was very close with cats. And look, I mean, he went through an unimaginable ordeal that will obviously color the rest of his life. But I do hope that he has found some peace and that he's not. I mean, look, he went on the stand in Fort Bragg and he apologized and confessed and got emotional thinking about what he did. He knew what he did was wrong. He knew what he did led, even if in a very indirect way, that McChrystal, Petraeus, and Flynn used for their own reasons. Nonetheless, he knows that his actions led to putting a lot of people in harm's way. And he'll have to live with that forever. And that's a very hard reality to live with. But he shouldn't have to be this low-ranking guy who made a dumb mistake shouldn't have to be the scapegoat of America's longest foreign war and a failed war.
Well, I mean, it's like the most typical thing ever that if we're going to blame somebody, we're going to blame the lowest ranking guy possible, right?
Classic Army maneuver, right?
Yeah. I mean, I hope people will go out and read American Cipher. It was, suffice to say, it was an eye opener for me. You really spent a lot of time covering like every angle of this story and really getting inside it. There's some really unique interviews in it. Before we get going here, are there any final thoughts, anything that you think people ought to know about the Bowe Bergdahl story or where this has led you over the years?
Well, I mean, I really appreciate you, reflecting on this today. And, I just think, especially this moment in America where our politics is so broken and so silly and has become such a cartoon, I think about the year the book came out. I went back to Haley in Ketchum, Idaho, and I did a book talk there. And it was the largest audience that turned out for a book talk by far. I mean, there were over 300 people, overflow capacity at the local library. It was the first and only time that I'm aware of that Bob and Jamie Bergdahl came out in public for an event around the book or around anything involving what they went through. And a guy shows up sitting right across from them wearing a t-shirt that said, "Fuck Bergdahl." And, everyone in the room saw this and it created this terrible tension. Ketchum police sent an officer in a bulletproof vest into the talk because people were really worried that maybe something violent could happen here. And it's just such a travesty and it's such a needless form of self-destruction in our own society. People are so willing to jump on whatever new story the media is spinning about who's someone we should hate and who's the bad guy is. And really, it's nothing profound here, but just getting to know people in these stories and getting to know the real history and the real people involved is a much, much more worthwhile endeavor. And I hope that our book helps a little bit in that. And I hope that people take a lesson from that they can put on whatever the next version of the Bowe Bergdahl story that comes our way.
Well, thank you, Michael. And again, the book is American Cipher. I hope people go check it out. And until next time, I'm Jack Murphy, and this is Military Matters.
This episode was written by Jack Murphy and produced by Rod Rodriguez. You can follow Military Matters on Twitter at StripesMMPod. Be sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcast and save 50% on your digital subscription at stripes.com when you use promo code podcast. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
And we'll see you at the next episode.